Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'll begin this session by making a small remark. As they say, you can take a Kashmiri out of Kashmir, but you cannot take Kashmir you cannot take Kashmir out of a Kashmiri. So I just wanted to share this small anecdote with you. And the year is 1898. And this young monk from Bengal comes on his second visit to Kashmir Valley. And he travels all across. And finally, in the last leg of his journey, he comes to a village called Tulmul in central Kashmir, which is home to Kashmir's most revered goddess, Maharagya. And he asks his fellow sannyasis to leave him alone because he wants to perform certain rituals, homas, yagyas, etc. And while performing these rituals, he has this divine vision of the goddess. He enters into a trance of sorts, where he enters into this conversation with the goddess. And before this pilgrimage, he has traveled across Kashmir and he has seen what hundreds of years of invasions and conquests have done to Kashmir. He visits some of the magnificent ruins where the temple stood at some point in time. And he's deeply disappointed that his heart is broken. And with this heartbreak, he addresses the goddess in the trance. And he says that I'm heartbroken to look at the destruction of your temples. And the goddess replies back to him saying that, I'm the protector, not the other way around. You are my child, I'm not your child. What is it to you that my temples are being defiled? Now, when I was young, I read this, I heard this story from my grandfather. I was very fascinated with it. But as I also grew up and I read more about it, I also felt it was symptomatic of what the writer V.S. Naipaul alludes to in India, Wounded Civilization, when he says, and I'm quoting him, out of a superficial reading of the past, out of the sentimental conviction that India is eternal and forever revives, there comes not a fear of further defeat and destruction, but an indifference to it. India will somehow look after itself. The individual is free of responsibility. Now that we have given up the colonial yoke and hundreds of years of invasions and conquests, the time now is to see how do we decolonize the mind. This is what Minister M.J. Akbar alluded to in his speech yesterday. It's a fact that the Britishers came and they colonized us, but the fact also is that blaming them for everything will be an act of cowardice, like Minister Akbar said. Because the point is that they did not win, as he said. We also lost. So how do we take this? How do we define an intellectual? How do we define the role of an intellectual in 21st century? So to begin with, I'm just going to ask all my panelists to make their introductory remarks, and then we'll take the discussion ahead from there. So begin with Minhaz, would you like to start?
Thank you, Rahul, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think taking off from what Rahul said on the issue of Kashmir, I think we need to talk about that in some detail a little later on. But if we have to redefine our priorities as a builder of the nation, I think what we've got to focus on are 5 things. Number 1, what is the national interest? What does it involve? It's not just empty jingoism, ultranationalism that people deliberately and mischievously conflate nationalism with. Nationalism is basically protecting the national interest. And that's what every right-thinking, and I use the word right with a small r, but every right-thinking Indian should want to do. And we must remember that nationalism of the German kind of the 1930s, which is aggressive, conquering, etc., is very different from the nationalism of the 1930s again of Gandhiji, which was to protect the country's future, and which led to the freedom movement and so on. The second point, the priorities that we must have, is our economic policy making. And without a strong economy, no country is going to be taken seriously. So I think whether it's on taxation, priorities on less bureaucracy, more technocracy in our society, in our government, I think that's an important factor. The third of these 5 issues is social inclusiveness. We talk a lot about secularism, but I think it's been badly defined, just like nationalism. And what we really need to do is to ensure that we empower the minorities and not appease them. And educate, empower, not appease. I think that's important, and we'll talk about that later. Very briefly, the 4th and 5th, governance. We've got to get the government to engage in things like the Lokpal, the Right to Information Act, which has become dysfunctional. So the government has a lot to do in terms of governance. And finally, on geopolitics. India is a rising economy. Our GDP is going to be, in terms of purchasing power parity, is already $8 trillion. It's the 3rd largest in the world after America and China. So in terms of geopolitics, there are going to be 2 poles eventually in the next 10 or 20 years, the Chinese pole and the American pole. With the quadrilateral America, Japan, Australia, and India, that is an important geopolitical thing that we've got to look at and make sure that India actually punches at its correct geopolitical weight. The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the victory we won there, the Doklam standoff, again, the victory that we got there against China. These are areas that we can discuss in the coming half an hour, 1 hour. Thank you.
Over to you, Makarand.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and privileged to. I want to thank the India Foundation, its excellent team, Ram Madhavji, and also Kiranji, who's just stepped in, and my wonderful co-panelists. I want to focus on 3 points. Rahul, you started by bringing to our mind one of the great thought leaders of India, Swami Vivekananda, and the complex, double-edged experience he had, where he shifts back, not back, but shifts to Bhakti Yoga from Karma Yoga after almost 9 years of ceaseless work. He's coming to the end of his life, and the vision of the goddess that he has at Kshir Bhavani, where the goddess says, do you protect me or do I protect you? Why I call it double-edged is on the one hand, it suggests that we are not really in charge of our destiny, that the forces of history and the forces of change are so complex, and there is a divine dispensation that directs the course of human affairs. And on the other hand, as I said, it's double-edged because it seems to negate individual agency and may take us to tamasic complacence and inactivity. So thank you for bringing that up. But in that same tradition, let me invoke another great Indian thought leader, Sri Aurobindo. In the 1920s, his brother Barindra has been released from Andamans, from the cellular jail, where he's been sent to life imprisonment. And Sri Aurobindo writes this long letter to Barindra in Bangla, which has been translated. And to me, it's really a blueprint, like a template of the new India. And I think that he identifies the cause of India's weakness. And may I please read just a little excerpt?
Yes, please.
He says the main cause of India's weakness, Aurobindo is saying that the main cause of India's weakness is not subjection, nor poverty, nor a lack of spirituality or religion, but a diminution of the power of thought, the spread of ignorance in the birthplace of knowledge. I'm quoting him. He says, everywhere I see an inability or unwillingness to think, incapacity of thought or thought phobia. That is why, Rahulji, I think that this session is really important. Shopanda also alluded to an uncritical understanding of history. Now, once we speak of intellectual leadership, I would like to focus on 2 things after this quotation, which is one of the great things about Sri Aurobindo is he gives you a methodology of understanding India, but not in a backward-looking fashion. that you go back, in other words, the way to the future lies through the past. This is what he's suggesting. Now, so let's very briefly look at the models of leadership that we have in our own civilization. We already heard from Mr. M, Shri M. He quoted from the Gita. We have an avataric model of leadership. You know, yada yada dharmasya glanir bhavati, and so on. And if you read Kumaraswamy, he says that most Hindu texts, ancient Hindu texts, are about gods or heroes. So that is one model of leadership. And if you want to wed it with some modern ideas, it's like the Weberian idea of charismatic leadership. But we also have another model of leadership which comes from the so-called shamanic traditions, the Buddhist, the Jain, the free-thinking model. And I'd like you to think about the last scene between the Buddha when he's about to pass into the parinirvana and his favorite disciple Ananda. And Ananda is distraught. He says to the Tathagat, after you, what will happen to us? And he says, Atto Deepo Bhava, Atma Deepo Bhava, be a lamp unto yourself. So on the one hand, you have the idea of an avataric leadership, a great hero. On the other hand, you have the idea of leadership, which is each one is a leader. And I think hardly any civilization gives you this incredible range of how to maximize your potential as a human being. In fact, one way to define Indic civilization is it's a civilization of self-culture to maximize human potential. This is what brings me to the last point in this initial intervention, which is to think about the future. Where do we go from here? And again, if you look at the Nietzschean idea of the Superman, and in a sense, Iqbal is using it also, when he says, Khudi ko kar itna buland, you know. So this Nietzschean Superman is a kind of New Age titan who imposes his or her will on the whole of society without a moral responsibility. But the Indian idea of leadership, again as Sri Aurobindo would call it, what he says, supramentalization. Acharya Vamdev Shastriji is right here. And it is really about shifting your consciousness. So the new leader is somebody who can shift his or her consciousness and also the consciousness of everyone else. Because only then can you get a better world. So it's not an egoistic imposition of one's ideas on other people. And here is where I really feel that we have to move from just the individual to the collective. So that leadership, in a sense, is not, even if there's a great leader in the middle, when we were coming in, Shaktiji was saying, look, you're circling everybody. So even if you have a sun and constellation model, I think leadership is about working collectively for a common good. And I want to end by referring back to what Sri Aurobindo said in his 1920 letter, where he says that leadership is also about the Sangha. He uses the word Sangha before the RSS was founded, by the way. Please read the letter. So I think that places like this, we are creating a Sangha in the best sense of the word, a Sangha which can then change the narrative, which can bring about a different ecology, a new consciousness, not just for India, but for the whole world. And this is the idea of leadership which is integral, which takes into account economic, social, political, cultural, in the worldly sense, and in the individual psychological sense, it takes into account the physical, the vital, the intellectual, the psychic, and the spiritual. Thank you.
Thank you, Makarand.
Thank you, India Foundation, for inviting me in this discourse. And our co-panelist has said very important thing. I will extend from there. I extend from one of my experience, and I'm going to talk about a different kind of social location. And once I was coming from my village, and I saw a person from Dalit caste. He was there in the field, and he was singing a song. Song was in Bhojpuri. Kahoi rai rai pai pai jodi ke ek din ud jai hai suganwa pinjara ke chhod ke. So this, you can remember, this is the time of greed, time of whatever you accumulate, and one person of Dalit community singing this song while working in the field. From where this consciousness came to him? Who is his intellectual leader? I think Kabir, Ravidas, Shiv Narayan, and so many small Dalit saints created a consciousness, and that consciousness circulates in the social milieu of marginal communities, and that gave them a kind of intellectual leadership. So intellectual leader may be person and maybe the thought and ideas. So, and this thought and ideas had multiple levels. One level is this about whom I am talking. Second thing, every community needs its own intellectual. Without intellectual, community can't get identity, can't become visible. So, in poetry you used to say, जब तक चिड़ियों के नहीं होंगे इतिहासकार, शिकारी के गौरवान्वित होते रहने की पूरी संभावना है. So every word needs its own historian, own intellectual. So in that way, and we work on Dalit communities in Uttar Pradesh, and what we found in our research, that the community, those who are visible in UP politics among Dalits, they produce their own intellectuals. And most of the intellectuals are from those communities, only 4 or 5 communities, Chamar, Pasi, Dhobi, Kori. But more than 50 communities, those who have not intellectuals, those who have not writers, not journalists, not scholars, they are invisible. They are invisible because they don't have voice. Who represent the voice? And the second function of the intellectual, one is the thought and ideas, second is the representation, and representation by an intellectual as a person. And third is, are we only intellectual? Those who got educated in Cambridge, in US, or in big universities of the world, or those who are even illiterate, they are also intellectuals, because they represent wisdom, and wisdom is also a side of intellectuality. Wisdom can be extended to a level from where you can intellectualize that wisdom. I tell you one small anecdote, and then maybe we will open a discussion for other issues. And we were collecting stories from the villages, and we were talking to a women of Dalit caste, and tell a story, kuch kahani kahiye. That lady narrated me a story, and it's the Kori family. Kori means the weaver family, and it's a lot of population you can find in Bundelkhand of the Kori community. And she was telling a story ki once there was a Kori husband and wife. They were working together. They were weaving clothes and earning money, living a comfortable life. Once they worked hard and they earned a lot of money. So wives requested husband that to go, please go to the market and buy meat. आज meat खरीद के ले आओ और बढ़िया से बनाएंगे, खूब आराम से खाएंगे और सोएंगे. So that person went to the market at the 4 p.m. and 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, he returned back around 12. When he came, everyone was sleeping in the village. जैसे दिया बुझ जाता है, अंधेरा फैल जाता है गाँव में. No, it was like that. So when he came and knocked the door, wife opened the door, and then he asked for food. Wife said, food में क्या हुआ? रोटी और प्याज ला के रख दिया. तो he said that तुमने आज मीट नहीं बनाया क्या? तो कहा मीट कैसे बनाते? मीट तो तुम लाए ही नहीं. कल आए ही नहीं. मैंने मीट तो 5 बजे शाम को ही खरीद के गिद्ध को दे दिया था. I gave the meat at 5 to the vulture. तो wife said, if you will give meat to the vulture, it will reach to me. अगर आप गिद्ध को मीट दे दोगे तो क्या हमारे तक पहुंचेगा? You can see the whole debate about distribution in democracy, and this illiterate women is haunting, is attacking or satiring that if you will give the meat to the vulture, it will not reach to the right hand, to the right place. So that kind of wisdom also represents a form of intellectuality. You can say it may be not in a good English, it may be not in a good, published in a good journal, but it's intellectuality. It's a kind of intellectuality. And intellectuality can't be only in the written form, also in the oral form. So there are multiple levels of intellectuality. And what, friends, what we need now today, there are, and remember, I think Makarand will appreciate Milan Kundera. But there are the people who have experience, but they don't have language. And there are the people who have language, but they don't have experience. We need intellectuals, those who have experience and also language. And so the community who have experience, we need to see the evolution of language among them so that they can represent the community. But there is a problem, friends. Problem is now society is changing from oral to written. The state, in fact, dictates the form of intellectuality. How? You need someone to write applications from your community to represent the community, to the interest of, protect the interest of the community. So written form is important. Likhat padhat ka samaj. Now it is a society of likhat padhat. So community needs a kind of transference from orality to written culture, especially in terms of production of intellectuality, because you need representation to the state, a language which can interact with the state, or that should be in the written form. It's a kind of techno state language, a state techno language. You need to imbibe, and that's why the form of intellectuality is being changed. But still we need Kabir, Ravidas and Shiv Narayan kind of intellectuality. And if you will not provide them, they will explore their own intellectuals from the community itself. So that's the...
I'm the youngest, so I get to speak last, so which is a privilege. What I thought I will structure at least my comments on is why is intellectual leadership needed, and what is the status of India today. So why is intellectual leadership needed, and why for a country like ours? There's this British economist called Angus Maddison. Yes. How many of you have heard of him? Very good number. No doubt there's an intellectual crowd. Angus Maddison had done analysis of the GDPs of various countries through history. And India was among the richest or the second richest country for most of human history till 1750, 1800 around. And in fact, and you find stories attached to this everywhere. There's an emperor, Roman emperor called Emperor Vespasian, who had banned trade, Roman trade with India, because Rome was going bankrupt, sending gold to India, importing goods from us. So we were like the China of the ancient world. We were like the America of the ancient world as well, because we used to get immigrants from anywhere, Persians, Jews. They would come out here, they would find a safe home, and they would innovate and create value out here. And what was the basis for our wealth and power in ancient India? There are some countries which have built their wealth because they just got lucky. भाई लैंड में सोना निकल आया, प्रेशियस स्टोन्स निकल आया, ऑयल निकल आया, चल अमीर बन गए. Correct? Some countries have built wealth because they were very good at violence. The Turks, for example, or the Mongols, for example, would conquer other lands, loot their money, दूसरे का पैसा है, लूट के अपने पास ले आए, अमीर बन गए. What is the source of India's wealth? Did we conquer other lands and loot money from them to become rich? No, right? Yeah? Did we have huge reserves of oil or gold or precious stones and therefore we became rich? No. The source of our wealth was our people, our intellectual leadership. And unfortunately, we teach nothing of that in our own education system. In areas like metallurgy, in trading, in navigation, in mathematics, like Bodhayana ji had discovered Pythagoras' theorem before Pythagoras did. Unfortunately, most of us Indians are not taught that. In every area we had innovation, we had intellectual leadership, and we were willing to learn, not just teach others, but we were willing to learn from everywhere around the world as well. We were, like I said earlier, a bit like the America of the ancient world, and this was the root of our wealth and power, our own people, our own brilliant intellectual leadership. Once we lose that, then we lose our ability to make ourselves wealthy and powerful once again. And this is I think the concern that brings me to an issue which really troubles me a lot, which I speak of a lot, our education system and our popular culture today. हमारे इंडिया में इंसान जितना पढ़ लिख जाए उतना ज़्यादा अंग्रेज़ बन जाता है. Education is almost a route to cut us off from our roots. Rarely have I seen a country which is so rich in its heritage, but so enthusiastic. Forget about learning it, we don't even want to acknowledge it. If someone speaks that, we had surgery in ancient India and read Shushruthji's great works, he will be laughed at. We're not even taught that in our education system. We don't encourage our students. Our popular culture speaks nothing of our ancient culture. And I'm not anti-West or other things. We should learn from other popular and successful cultures as well. But we should celebrate our own so that we develop our own, or rather redevelop our own traditions of intellectual leadership. And how can we change our education system and our popular culture to start reconnecting to our roots and start learning from our really brilliant ancestors? If our ancestors were in the heavens and looking down at us, they would be embarrassed of what we've done. How can we make ourselves worthy of the brilliance of our ancestors is something that I think all of us should focus our attention on. And I agree with something that Rahul said, that we have to stop blaming the British and our invaders. They've been gone for 70 years. Enough is enough. Now let's look at ourselves. What are we doing and we have to take charge to improve ourselves. That's a thought that I want to leave.
That's a very important observation, Amish, about the education system and what we, from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, get to read in our textbooks. Very recently I made a short pilgrimage through Tamil Nadu, and I visited some of the areas of interest, and this old professor of economics in Madurai, he led me to his ancestral village in the adjoining district of Sivaganga, where I went to this temple which was built by these two king brothers, the Murudu brothers as they call them, who offered resistance to British about 60, 70 years before the 1857 revolution. And I was just, and they were ultimately hanged by the British. And I was just wondering, as a boy growing up in Kashmir, reading NCERT textbooks, I knew everything about Thomas Jefferson, about the Boston Tea Party, but I knew nothing about my one area of my own country. And that's really a tragedy. So I just wanted to begin with you only because you're a popular author, and you have popularized a certain element of culture in this country, and I think in that endeavor you're only next to Ramanand Sagar. So as they say,
sorry, that's too big a compliment.
So they say that there's no civilization that is not rooted in culture. When you visit these institutions, colleges, universities, etc., and you interact along with the younger generation, do you think there's a disconnect? Are they aware of the culture, the point that you alluded to? Is there a disconnect you feel somewhere?
I think it is a tribute to the strength of our culture, that despite the system trying everything to make us forget, we still freaking refuse to forget. And that is the strength of our culture. And I see that in the youth of today, and that makes us so proud. That makes me so proud. And I'm saying that across all faiths, across all communities, across all language groups in India. And you mentioned about the south. For me, it's so pleasurable to go to the south often, because in the north many of our temples have been destroyed. Many of the ancient cultures aren't there. I'd gone to Vadakunnathan temple. Any Malayalis out here? Anyone from Kerala? So I'd gone to Vadakunnathan temple out there. Beautiful temple, an ancient temple, and there's a beautiful Lord Shiva temple, a beautiful Lord Vishnu temple, and a Hariya temple in the middle. And I'd gone in the evening, and they do chanting out there. And of course, first, we went to the Lord Shiva temple. I get a little emotional when there's a Lord Shiva chant going on. And there were some, Malayali students around me. Some of them had read my book, so they recognized me, and but they weren't speaking English, and I unfortunately don't know Malayali too much. And but we were trying to communicate, and then the chanting started. And everyone out there, we got so moved. Many of us had tears in our eyes, and that shows the strength of our culture. We couldn't communicate in the language, but we were one at that time. And it shows the strength and power of the culture that comes all the way down. But having said that, we can't, at least the people who are running the show, people who are influencing things, can't assume that no matter what, our culture will survive. We have to help through the system. So something as basic as connecting and there are real problems when we don't teach things which are connected to our roots, to our realities. As simple as how many, in your schools, how many seasons are you taught in India? 4, right? Everyone is taught 4. I was taught the same thing when I was in the 2nd standard. My son, who's 8 years old, is taught the same thing. And the 4 seasons we were taught was summer, autumn, winter, spring. And I remember when I was in school, I'd ask my teacher, "Ma'am, monsoon kahan gaya?" And actually, India has 6 seasons. There are and even something as basic as that is not connected to our roots. You see our architecture schools. They don't teach anything which is connected to our realities, our own Vastu Shastra. So, because Vastu Shastra is derided as superstitions, and which is why you'll find many of the buildings, modern buildings that are made in India, have nothing to do with Indian realities. We build glass wall buildings which make no sense in the Indian sun because they are so hot inside. Glass wall buildings make sense in Western Europe because there's no sun there. They don't make any sense in India. So many things, our maths, we have to take charge of the system itself, of the education system, of popular culture. What we are taught in school is all Shakespeare. We are not taught Mirza Ghalib. We are not taught Kalidasa. We are not taught Shudraka. We are not taught Thiruvalluvar. I studied in Tamil Nadu, so I heard of Thiruvalluvar, but so many North Indians have not heard of it, which is an embarrassment. These are things that we can't just assume that somehow we will survive. That can't be our attitude. We have to try and force changes in the system as well.
So Makarand, how do we go from here? Is education really the answer? Do we deal with education first and then build up from there?
See, this is a extremely important and complex issue. When I was listening to my dear friend Badri, it struck me that, when we think about leadership, and if you read Gramsci, he talks about 3 kinds of intellectuals. First, there are the traditional intellectuals, which include, in his framework, priests and professors and so forth, who've had the job of, carrying forward the tradition. And then there are organic intellectuals, those who emerge from within society. And finally, there are party intellectuals, that is, those who belong to a political organization which is spearheading change. It seems to me in India today we have the same situation. But the change that you're talking about, Rahulji, has to be done at all these levels. See, because the transmission of ideas in India has never been through ideologues, people who sit in ivory towers, air-conditioned rooms and preach. There are people who embody the tradition who are called exemplars. They're exemplary people. In other words, what you spoke of, in every community, in every caste, in every class of India, you will find people who are living the life that they consider worth living, which embodies the highest values of their tradition. And people gather around them and learn from them. They're not bookish intellectuals. So it is the exemplar who transmits the Sanatana, the so-called Parampara, right? Now, the problem is that both the so-called party intellectual as well as the traditional intellectual, the professors and the priests and so forth, yahan bahut gadbad ho gaya hai na? Because the exemplary organic intellectual, jo lok dhara se juda hua hai ya jude hue hain, wo to theek hai. Magar the other side needs a complete change, and I think the education system is in a state of utter disrepair. We've got so much confusion. We should have invested at the bottom of the pyramid, creating very good public school education for everyone, which is free or almost free and available to everyone. And then at the top, we should have let society take care of itself, invest in what it needs. Instead, we have failed to give everyone access to education. We only have legislation, which is actually, in many ways, really, really harmful. We know RT se kya ho raha hai. And at the top, we tinker with quotas and giving communities things. We have created a system of entitlement, not of competence. And our youngest, our young and bright, we export outside. We are only good at mindware. I don't think we are really good at, we are not in the forefront of ideas or at the forefront of inventions in any realm, in fact. So we are in a great crisis, and I hope that at least in the next, tenure of the NDA, I hope, 2019, they're really going to take this up. Because, if I may say so, in this 5-year interregnum, in education, nothing much has been done. It's been on a back burner. But radical changes are required to change the ecosystem. And it's not creating policies, it's not creating top-down systems. For example, if you go to the United States, every high school is free to have its own curriculum. It's not standardized. And how do you go after that? Then there are SATs or GREs or GMATs to filter people. So I think we need great decentralization and greater freedom rather than top-down, commandments, which are very difficult to implement. The language policy is also at 6s and 7s, And there's a great Angrezi Hatao, movement, or at least I would say sentiment. So I think Angreziyat Hatao is good. Lekin Angrezi Hatao may be inimical. I think we should promote all our languages, and Sanskrit should also be promoted, but not necessarily in a compulsory, mandatory, interventionist, statist fashion. So iske piche bahut soch ki zarurat hai. And I think that I hope that everybody in this room and people elsewhere who are concerned will give this a deep thought. And the last thing I want to say is, at least when it comes to primary education, we need a new model. It can't just be a government thing. It has to be, I think, a public-private partnership with parameters and accountability. And only then can we really reassume our position as an intellectual, cultural, and critical leader. I think I agree with you, Amish, that we were a great civilization because we were innovative. We were not afraid to learn. We were not insecure. And in fact, like Naipaul said, we are standing on the rubble of a great civilization, and we don't even have the competence to understand how great it was. You see, we don't even know enough about ourselves. So a lot needs to be done in the next 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And somebody spoke, my friend Rajiv spoke about Indian exceptionalism. If there is an Indian exceptionalism, it should be based on the idea that the rise of India is not for itself, but for the whole world, for humankind. Because modernity, the project of modernity is itself flawed. It's like a bhasmasur, and it's only a wisdom. You spoke about wisdom. Rationality alone cannot save us. And that wisdom is only available in that unbroken chain. Everybody had the ancient wisdom, but it got lost. And only a few societies seem to have access to it. And that is why, in a way, the rise of India is so important. It's not to dominate anybody else. And I think everybody has to realize this. And what you said, when we talk about integral leadership for tomorrow, the integration also has to be social, And somebody said this century is the century of women's power. I completely agree. We have to integrate all the deprived sections, you see, and create non-hierarchical horizontalities, new kinds of cosmopolitanism. So it requires deep thinking and collective work. Thank you.
Minhaz, I'm just going to pick up from there. When it comes to intellectual thought, there's a sense of inadequacy which permeates us. What Makarand referred to as Angreziyat. So most of the leadership thought comes from the West, from the the received wisdom comes from the West. Why haven't we been able to change it so far?
Thanks. I think to begin with, I believe the educational system that we've got has one very big fundamental flaw. We teach our children not to be leaders, but to be followers. There's a great deal of rote learning, and that has to change. We've got to make our children, our young adults think, and think like leaders of the future, not just follow old traditions. I'm also slightly contrarian in the context of intellectual leadership. I believe that real leadership, whether it comes from the West or it's Indian, intellectual leadership really should focus on outcomes. Intent is good, it's excellent, but apart from intent, you've got to have outcome. And our country has a huge panoply of problems. We've got hunger, poverty, disease, malnutrition. So to talk in the abstract all the time of intellectual this and intellectual that is good, but you can't stop there. You've got to go into outcomes, and the outcomes are measurable, whether it's in poverty alleviation, or it's in malnutrition, hunger, etc., in having a more inclusive society. All of that is an outcome-oriented attitude, which is what real leadership is. And the educational system that we spoke about, where we teach rote learning, it's also got two other sort of branches which encourage this. One is our parents. They teach us complete obedience, which is culturally very good. But it also teaches you not to question. And when you don't question, you don't really progress. And again, third is a slightly controversial point, but you've got to make it if you've got to be honest, is that in our religion, all our religions, whether it's Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, whatever, Christianity, again, obedience to a particular line of thinking is what is promoted. And that, again, does not encourage the creation of leaders. So to answer your question in a slightly roundabout way, why don't we create leaders? It's because of schools, rote learning, parental obedience, and religious doctrine. So these are three things. And finally, EPAG, the acronym EPAG, is what should be the outcome orientation. We have good education that leads to ultimately public interest, a groundswell of public interest, which will then lead to accountability in the governing class, and that will lead to good governance, which will solve the real problems of the country. Thanks.
I'm just going to ask Makarand what Minhaz said. Why is it a problem that we've not been able to create this genuine intellectual ecosystem? Especially now that we have a new government which has been all there for three years now. We've heard the Prime Minister speak about 100 minds a year, etc., etc. But sadly, nothing has happened so far. So what is happening? Why are we lagging behind?
Well, I'm an optimist. I think that the way the government and all its strategists work is by setting some priorities, and I think they're going to get to that point slowly. But the thing I want to say, Rahulji, is basically that we shouldn't rely on the government for everything. We have to do things, and I think that we've seen many initiatives coming from civil society to create a new generation of leaders, intellectual leaders. And here I wanted to say one thing which is really important. The Indian contribution to thinking on what constitutes leadership is crucial, because in the West, especially in the United States, you have innovation and leadership through hyper-individualism. Whether it's Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, whoever their models are people who are unaccountable, even creative leaders, They are sort of solitary geniuses who have dysfunctional lives and do things which are completely out of the box and really trample over several people who are in their way, including, in a sense, the present US president may be seen as a version of that sort of leader. And then at the other end of the spectrum, or on the other side of the world, you have the Chinese model of collective leadership, of huddling together. And really, I mean, sometimes the people are not people but sheeple. You know, there are authoritarian structures and the people have no voice. I think we have to go between these two poles in India and show a kind of leadership which is not hyper-individualistic, nor does it mean a complete loss of individuality and surrender of responsibility, but a new kind of leadership. And coming back to your original question, I think that eventually this issue of education and creating the right ecosystem will also be taken up by the government. And in the meanwhile, all of us have to do our bit. And this is already happening, as you can see.
Can I
Badri, you
just
wanted
add
to-
one? Sorry.
Sure.
If I can just add one thing where I agree with what Minhaz and Makarand said, I think because the education the system that we have today, especially the primary schooling system, is what the British left us with. And the British picked up what was the Prussian education system at that time. The Prussian education system was built on because they had a huge shortage of teachers and they wanted to increase literacy dramatically. So at that point of time, it may have seemed like a very fair system. You know, 40, 50 students per class, one teacher, standard syllabus, you know, assembly line khadi kar do, and you can educate a lot of people. But that wasn't our system. You know, if you read Dharampalji's works, I wonder, you know, I hope everyone has read Dharampalji here. How are the beautiful tree, how our education system was. The Gurukuls, the madrasas, the pathshalas, the way it was, the teacher-student ratio, it was much more questioning. Secondly, when you actually understand our culture, you will realize that at our heart is a questioning culture. We are not an obedient culture. We are a very rebellious, you know, questioning culture. Rig Veda, in Vedic Sanskrit, there is no translation for the English word blasphemy. And we need to revive that. Yes, we need to revive that.
Rahul, can I say something? Actually, I want to, I was desperate because I wanted to take this discussion from this schooling and education, and this is not only one form of remembering culture, and this is not only one form to going to the root. There are other forms also in the society. So education largely reshape the society, social habitus, but people have their own informal ways of inspiring their generations, transferring the knowledge from one generation to another generations, and this is apart from the school. And this school of the life is the bigger school than the school which government is forming and giving us as a pedagogy. So this, I tell you one example. We were working in Bundelkhand area, and in very smaller Dalit community like Kalwar, like Kanjar, like Kabutri, and we found that every community has a small space in the near Basti, and there is a small statue, नहीं कहते mound, छोटा सा एक स्थान बना हुआ है, and they used to sit there and talk, discuss in the evening. शाम को कोई एक जगह है जहाँ बैठ के बतियाते हैं, and in that batiana is also a form of a school. No, it's because उसमें different generation, people of different generation, young boy, Budha, Baba, Dadi, they all sit together and talk, and that's a part of cultural life of the village. So that's another form of schooling. Why this culture is still memory against forgetting? No, the state is trying to, modernity is trying to create a condition in which we forget that kind of cultural roots. But the community in their own life, what Makarand has said, they live life like that. And in that life, they remember culture. They live with the culture. And every community has a Agari Devi, Falani Deva, Falani Devi, small Devis, and there's a space, a social space where they interact and discuss. So that's the second thing. Third thing is that what Makarand suggested, that a kind of integrative leadership we need, who can integrate these marginals, the women, and we don't have much time, but if we'll have time, I'll share you so many wisdomful the maslas, the stories narrated by women in the villages, Those, they narrated to us, we have recorded them in our archive. And it's a wonderful intellectual insight of the community. Everyone has its own intellectual self within even illiterate have intellectual side. Only thing is we got opportunity to develop that intellectual side and they didn't get an opportunity to interact, to develop that intellectual side. And lastly, that this, I fully agree with my friend Makarand, this rationality and the modernity, this education is a part of that. And they created escapism in the soul. हमारे आत्मा में विखंडन पैदा कर दिया. एक सोशियोलॉजिस्ट हैं, ए.के. शरण, बहुत अच्छे सोशियोलॉजिस्ट हैं. वो कहते हैं कि मॉडर्निटी ने हमारी आत्मा में विखंडन पैदा कर दिया. इस विखंडन को कैसे जोड़ा जाए, दैट्स द इंटेलेक्चुअल चैलेंज. एंड दिस विखंडन एट वेरियस लेवल्स. At one level, organic intellectuals and the kind of we as academic intellectuals or the political intellectuals, उनको कैसे जोड़ा जाए, public intellectuals. And second is ये जो different जो culture के साथ जो disintegration पैदा कर दिया गया, उसको कैसे जोड़ा जाए. That's the challenge before the intellectual leader of the 21st century. How to, yeah.
Rahul, I'll just add a footnote, just very briefly. You see, these two sectors, the formal sector and the informal sector, are today in a state of civil war. Because the formal sector has been produced through colonization and the informal sector is still alive. So the real challenge is to change the ecosystem so that they become in harmony, you know, so that what you're saying, we should create the ecosystem where India becomes a learning society for lifelong learning. So चौपाल में जो बातें होती हैं और स्कूल में होती है, उनमें एक सुरता होनी चाहिए. अभी तो दोनों में clash है. And this is that Vikhandan that you're speaking of, the schizophrenic Indian or India, which is a product of colonization and this colonial modernity. If we can change that and bring them into harmony, we're going to do it, I think.
I have a question on the app by Shilpi Tiwari, who asks, are the intellectual leaders of today facing a credibility crisis? Amish?
Depends on who you mean by intellectual leaders. Of certain university in Delhi, yeah, maybe they are. But I think, you know, intellectuals who are connected to our roots will rise. And that is a good thing. That is something that we should celebrate. I just want to caution one thing, which, you know, which I will add to what Makarand said, that we shouldn't, you know, in our own revival, we shouldn't turn against the kind of attitude that our ancestors had, because our ancestors were open to learning from anyone, including foreigners, which is why they were so brilliant. तो जो उन्होंने कहा कि अंग्रेजियत हटाइए, अंग्रेजी मत हटाइए. We shouldn't turn into, you know, English हटाओ, ये हटाओ, वो हटाओ, because then that's not really adding value to us. So one of the things that one finds in then what can be confused in an anti-intellectual atmosphere is turning into an anti-English atmosphere as well. मतलब मेरे माँ बाप जो थे वो हिंदी मीडियम में पढ़े थे, हुनर की कुछ कमी नहीं थी, काबिलियत की कुछ कमी नहीं थी, जो कठिनाइयाँ उन्हें उठानी पड़ती थी, मतलब हमने देखी है, यू नो, कि अच्छी नौकरियाँ के लिए, हर चीज़ के लिए. और इसलिए उन्होंने निर्णय लिया था कि हमारे जो भी 4 बच्चे हैं सबको अंग्रेज़ी मीडियम में पढ़ाएंगे. वो कहते थे अंग्रेज़ी पेट की भाषा है, मातृभाषा दिल की भाषा है, दोनों को याद करिए. Correct? So, and that is something that in our revival, we shouldn't become a mirror image of the ones we are rebelling against. Because then what's the point of winning? That is something we must always bear in mind. There shouldn't be any disdain, any hatred towards any foreign culture, because there's something to be learned from everyone. और हमारे ancestors का, हमारे पूर्वजों का वही attitude था.
My last question to you, Minhaz, and then we throw the floor open for questions. And this is one of my pet questions. You know, in India, we almost have this institutionalized office of a public intellectual who appear on TV studios and generalize everything. They have an opinion on everything from Aadhaar to food distribution, etc. Do we really need public intellectuals in this country?
What I'm going to say now might not please everyone. I think we need less intellectuals and people who really are doers, because we tend to be very abstract as a country, and we've got a huge lineage of learning from the Vedas, etc. I think there's a paucity of intellectualism, Rahul, Amish was saying earlier, and that paucity is in three categories. One, you have bad political leadership, and you've got that because the kind of politics that has evolved over the past 30 or 40 years has brought criminals, elements which are completely, who are tainted into the system. And the kind of intellectual leadership they provide is very poor. The second category is the economic and business leadership, which again has become so co-opted with the political leadership in terms of the license Raj. Today we don't have a license Raj, but we have the bureaucrats having constructed things like environment clearances, land laws, and this, that, and the other. So business people do not stand up and speak up. And when you have a budget, which we're going to have on February 1st, you'll find that every business leader from Kumar Mangalam Vella to Ratan Tata is going to give the budget 9 out of 10. So there is a certain amount of co-option there. And the third is academic leadership. And here I'm on very shaky ground with Makarand to my left. But I think academic leadership has been excellent, but they function sometimes in an ivory tower. And that, I think, should become more practical, more down to earth, more connected to people. And I think the leadership that we can then give to people will be more outcome oriented, where we deal with real problems of our country, which include the alleviation of poverty, hunger, disease, malnutrition, equality, social inclusiveness, and redefining the whole concept of secularism, to which perhaps you can return if you wish later, and nationalism. Thank you.